So please join us today in welcoming Dr. Khadijah Costley-White, who is an associate professor in the Department of Journalism and Media Studies at Rutgers University in New Brunswick. She earned her bachelor's at Swarthmore College with a self-designed major in social justice and received her master's and doctorate from the Annenberg School for Communication at the University of Pennsylvania. Dr. White researches race and gender in media, culture, and politics. Her book, The Branding of Right-Wing Activism, The News, Media, and the Tea Party, Oxford 2018, examines the rise of the Tea Party in online, print, broadcast, and cable news. Her articles have been published in the International Journal of Communication, Women's Study in Communication, and Media Theory. She also co-edited a special issue in Communication, Culture, and Critique. Dr. White has been a White House intern on the Obama Broadcast Media Team, a National Association of Black Journalists and United Nations Fellow, and an assistant producer for what used to be called Now with Bill Moyers. In 2020, she received a Whiting Public Engagement Fellow to complete a community media project on lockdown culture in schools. Dr. White has written and provided commentary on issues related to race, social movements, news, and politics. She has appeared in outlets that include Vice, National Public Radio, The Atlantic, The New York Times, The Root, Huffington Post, BBC, Washington Post, The Los Angeles Times, Quartz, Gizmodo, and BuzzFeed. She is also an activist, community organizer, and a founder of a community nonprofit, Soma Justice, which organizes for racial, social, and economic justice in South Orange and Maplewood, New Jersey. Please welcome Dr. Khadijah Costley-White. Dr. White, the floor is yours.
Everyone. So sad that I can't be there with you physically, but it's really lovely to see all of your faces. And I want to thank you all for having me to the University of Washington First Department of Communication, especially professors Patricia Moy and Marlena Joseph. I really appreciate you all working so hard for me to be here today. I think y'all are on a quarter system, if I recall. So I'm not sure where that puts you right now. This is our last week of classes, and I'm sure that we're all suffering pandemic fatigue. So I really appreciate you all taking time to listen to this presentation today, and I'm glad I got the chance to talk to you. So this, for me, is more of a semi-conversation, maybe me thinking out loud. It's really a reflection on my research on the rise of the Tea Party in news, which I write about in my book. And I just realized I need to share my screen with you all. You can't see what I see. Hold on for one quick second so I can make sure I'm doing that. Are we all together now? Y'all can see it? Okay, great. So this is gonna largely serve as a reflection on my research and the rise of the Tea Party in news, which I write about in my book, The Branding of Right-Wing Activism, and how I see it connecting to some of the media coverage of the January 6th insurrection and Trumpism more generally. So that's why I call it more of a reflection, right? I'm not actively analyzing the media coverage of January 6th, but I am trying to kind of look at what I found in my book and see some of the links to some of the media coverage I'm observing now. So I'll walk you through some of the key insights that come from my work on the rise of the Tea Party in news and how I see them connecting to the current political and media moment. And then I'll just close up with what I see us, or at least me, wrestling with right now. And I have a ton of notes jotted down for Q&A because during an almost 2-year pandemic with toddlers who are now 3 and 5, it continues to mean my brain lives on paper. So feel free to ask me anything during our discussion. And if for some reason I need to think on something, I'll ask you probably to email me and I'll get back to you later. Okay, so you're all probably asking, why should I care about the rise of the Tea Party, a conservative phenomenon that got kicked off almost 13 years ago? How does that connect to anything I care about today? Now, outside of the fact that some of those Tea Party folks, like the Trump's chief of staff, Mark Meadows, are at the very center of how we're talking about the insurrection, I'm hoping that my reflection provides some context so that I can answer that question by the end of my presentation. And instead of starting where this book begins, I'll actually start where the idea for this entire project began for me in 2010, when I was the only White House intern monitoring the media for the 2-person broadcast media team, and wondering how the hell the Tea Party was getting so much news coverage every day. And that's a photo of me in the top left, taken while I was helping a crew set up for a shoot at the White House. So it's always a fun photo for me to have. Okay, so throughout my time as an intern, the Tea Party was a regular topic in the national media on every major news network, but I couldn't figure out what it actually was. And so for me, 2 major things stood out that pulled me into looking more closely at its rise. Oh, sorry, sensitive touchpad. First, a poll showed that a majority of Americans, when I'm watching this reporting kind of peak, 55% of Americans had never even heard of the Tea Party. And 2, another thing that pulled me in was that I encountered a CBS poll in February 2010 that confirmed my suspicions that the Tea Party movement was not some sort of working class revolt that was overtaking America, which was the frame that I informally observed in the media. Of those who did identify as a Tea Party supporter, 1 poll showed that they were all older white Americans that many of them were older white Americans who were just as educated and made just as much money as the rest of the population. And this kind of undermined the popular conception of the Tea Party as a working class movement. And of course, this is important for me to note because it also mirrors the types of folks who've been arrested in January for the January 6th insurrection, even with this kind of long-standing populist Trumpism frame. As Cynthia Miller-Idris noted in a New York Times essay in January, a majority of the arrested January 6th attackers were employed, some of them teachers, chief executives, veterans, doctors, and lawyers. There's been a number of police officers and military reservists, business folks, and including at least 20 in my own state of New Jersey. So for my work looking at the Tea Party news, just so you know, in the book, I decided to look at news stories about the Tea Party in political blogs, cable, print, and broadcast news. And it wasn't a study of the Tea Party per se, it was really a study on how the Tea Party comes to be through the media and what that meant. What is the narrative that the media produces about the Tea Party? And so now the Tea Party, as I explained in my book, gets kicked off in a very particular way that I think is really important to keep in mind. Okay, so we're going to go back now more than 13 years to February 2009. And I am keenly aware that if there are any undergrads here, some of those folks might have been in elementary school. So this is a bit of history for you all. So I'll set the scene. Okay, so Barack Obama is inaugurated. We have the first Black Democratic, and we're just coming out of the campaign with the first Black Democratic presidential nominee who was up against the first potential woman Democratic Party presidential nominee, Hillary Clinton. We have the first potential woman vice president in that campaign, Sarah Palin. And we have a older white guy in his 70s, right? And so that's what that campaign looks like. And identity becomes really central to that campaign. And it marks, in my reading, the first time that reporters had regularly and frequently discussed race and gender, especially especially important in regards to the identities of major presidential candidates, as there would be a historical first with the victory of either party. Reporters used Obama's racial identity as symbolic of American progress. So if you look at the headline, it says magical at the one news headline at the top from the day after President Obama's election reads magical spell that will open new American era, as The Guardian defined it. And his race gets equated with novelty and progress as opposed to tradition and conservatism as represented by his opponent, John McCain. There's a great recession happening right now, right? The Republican Party at this moment is significantly diminished. So Democrats get control of both the House and the Senate and the presidency. And the Republican brand is basically tanked, right? We're in the kind of greatest recession since the Great Depression. And in the background, of course, in the journalistic landscape, there are all sorts of changes that have shifted the journalistic landscape over 40 years prior. And so we have all of these circumstances, right? You all are with me now in 2009, hopefully. and not in 4th grade. Okay, so, and then this happens in February 2009.
No, the new administration's big on computers and technology. How about this, President and new administration? Why don't you put up a website to have people vote on the internet as a referendum to see if we really want to subsidize the losers' mortgages, or would we like to at least buy cars and buy houses in foreclosure and give them to people that might have a chance to actually prosper down the road and reward people that could carry the water instead of drink the water?
Hey, Rick,
it's a novel idea.
Hey, Rick, did you?
What? Who thought that?
Yeah, they're like putty in your hands. Did you hear?
No, they're not, Joe. They're not like putty in our hands. This is America. How many of you people want to pay for your neighbor's mortgage that has an extra bathroom and can't pay their bills? Raise their hand. How about we all? President Obama, are you listening?
How about we all stop paying our mortgage? It's a moral hazard.
This is like mob rule here. I'm getting scared. I'm glad I'm.
Don't get scared, Joe.
Jason. Jason, you want to?
We're thinking of having a Chicago Tea Party in July. All you capitalists that want to show up to Lake Michigan, I'm going to start organizing.
What are you jumping in this time?
Okay, so that is Rick Santelli on CNBC. He's still a reporter there, right? I think he's even moved up the ranks. Now, there are a few key arguments that my book makes about this moment with Santelli and what it tells us about media and politics right now. Most importantly, that this impromptu call for a Tea Party leads to Santelli being widely credited and seen as the founder of the Tea Party movement. And though a major departure from traditional news values for reporting, such as objectivity and nonpartisanship, Santelli's rant was marked as a success and not a journalistic failure. Oh, and by the way, it's 6:44 on my end. So there are lots of clips in this presentation because yeah, I think they're fun and they keep us all awake. So so Santelli's rant gets marked as a success and not a journalistic failure.
No, the new administration.
A New York Times writer noted that there seemed to be no fallout there seems to be no fallout at all about this kind of rant that Santelli goes on, and that it just added to Santelli's publicity and popularity. The clip was not only circulated by major conservative blogs and news aggregators, CNBC, Santelli's network, also posted the video on its company website. It received 1.7 million views, making it the network's highest viewed online clip ever at the time, and it even receives an official response from the White House press secretary, Robert Gibbs. And though Santelli did not get sent to cover the first big tax day Tea Party protest in April that year, he said that he was, quote, pretty proud of this. And it's this one kickoff Santelli moment that I think also gestures to some of the key observations in the news, oh, and sorry, that's my 5-year-old. If you can hear him, hopefully you can't. And it's this one kickoff Santelli moment that I think also gestures to some of the key observations into the news reporting on the Tea Party, the rise of the Tea Party brand across news outlets, and its connection to the rise of Trump and the January 6th insurrection he kicked off. And so for me, this moment, to me represents a lot about what the media looks like and how we handle conservative news at this moment. So these are the 4 of the key patterns I observe, and I'll walk through them. So this is what I'm going to walk through as we as I discuss tonight. I argue that in my book, while there were indeed grassroots supporters and organizers of the Tea Party, that the Tea Party is best understood as a multifaceted discursive signifier that helped attract voters, got media attention, and help reinvent the Republican Party. In other words, the Tea Party functioned mostly as a brand. And so the importance of branding and brand culture is one of the first connections I see between my analysis of the Tea Party's rise in the context of the January 6th insurrection. Okay, so what do I mean by brand? What does brand mean? Now, by the term brand, I'm drawing on the work of scholars like Naomi Klein, who define a brand as an identity, an essence, or corporate consciousness, not about the products, but about what the brands mean to the culture and to people's lives. And I'll just go back to the previous slide, because this is how I explain what brand culture means in the book, the contemporary context in which commerce, political action, and identity construction overlap within a competitive capitalist landscape. Okay, so in the marketing of politics, a brand is a message or a story that builds lasting relationships with the target audience, creates strong emotional connections to policies or candidates that outweigh material consequences, or even work against, have people working against their own interests, provides a cognitive shortcut to understand a specific product and differentiate it from other similar competitors, and helps you differentiate it from other similar competitors, and two screens, sorry. So scholars have argued in the last 40 years, the communication between politicians and voters has transitioned into less face-to-face interaction, and much heavier reliance on broadcasting mediated images to voters. The rise of branding in political communication has meant a switch in news media's focus from substantive political issues and policies to an emphasis on image, personality, and emotions, especially when reporting on political phenomena like the Tea Party. One study actually of news coverage found that people receive much more information about political candidates from paid political ads than from news coverage, while news instead focused significantly more on campaign strategy and polling data than on policy. In a democracy, so for me, I'm thinking about, well, what is the impact of brand culture on democracy? So in a democracy, the rules and practices of government should most benefit the public. That is, building and developing policies for the public is key to a functioning democracy. In this framework, relaying information that helps the public understand policy is a vital function that journalists serve, right? The fourth estate, we all know that. So that people can communicate and react to the actions of their leaders and hold them accountable. But in a brand culture, the media tend to focus on how a politician makes one feel, not on the impact of the policies. One's identity connects to politics and reinforces those feelings. People in a brand culture are expected to vote their taste and not necessarily for specific political outcomes. That is, politics is a consumption in a brand culture, and citizenship becomes a lifestyle that emphasizes individualism and self-fulfillment. Politics in brand culture is a form of self-expression and identity rather than a tool of power and governance. In this way, a political brand culture often stands in conflict with the goals of democracy, which aims for a mutually beneficial society focused on best serving the public interest, or at least should be. So brands are not just labels or identifiers. They are identities rooted in social relationships. Race, gender, and class in particular help humanize and brand and increase its emotional appeal to consumers. And so frequently in covering the Tea Party, the news media helped promote populism as part of the Tea Party brand through their news narratives that focused on class, race, and gender, and you'll see that throughout this talk. And as I describe in my book, people are more attracted to a brand when it resembles how they see themselves and their values. And so one of the examples I use in the book to talk about how the news media helps is by promoting in political branding, this means drawing on powerful identities that eclipse their meaning or substance. So for example, I point out that Tea Party leader Sarah Palin uses the term Mama Grizzlies as a cognitive shortcut for referencing the conservative women candidates she supported. Mama Grizzlies invokes the idea of women, specifically white women, fighting for their children in the political battleground the way that a mama bear would naturally and violently fight for the safety of her own cubs. Ironically, a substantial number of Palin's Mama Grizzly candidates were not actually mothers at all. Still, Mama Grizzly was effective as an extension of the Tea Party's revolutionary populist brand because it functioned as a story that evoked feelings related to motherhood, softened anger and rage as a self-defense, and justified as maternal instinct any of their potentially harsh political attacks. So you'll see at the corner, there's one of the books that comes out of this moment is titled, "That's No Angry Mob, That's My Mom," right? So in branding, race and gender help make a brand seem more human, amplify its emotional connection to consumers. In similar ways, the term Tea Party, if you look at the top, I have like Victorian tea parties, right? Draw on historical notions of revolution, whiteness, populism, and domination to sell its own political brand, as well as kind of this other alternative softness. And it's a frame that gets repeated and legitimized through the news coverage. Now, I want you all to to keep this in mind, right? Because I'm coming back to January 6th at this moment. I want you to all keep in mind the way that the news media helped amplify and repeat this kind of narrative around mama bears and mama grizzlies, even as I play this clip from CBS Morning News reporting on January 6th, on the anniversary of January 6th.
What was it like in Washington on January 6th?
Well, it's a little chilly out here, but it was freezing there.
As people stormed the Capitol 1 year ago today, Sharon Story and her husband Victor did not follow the crowd inside.
People started singing the national anthem, and it came all across all of us. And everybody, once they started hearing it, was participating. And it was just exciting.
But this grandmother of 10, who had driven all the way from Gaffney, South Carolina to be there, firmly believes that the American democracy she used to teach about in her 6th grade classroom is on the edge of collapse. Do you think a civil war is possible in your lifetime?
I think if they push people too far against the wall, especially the Southerners, they're not going to take it.
That feeling of fraud, if only a feeling, is what led so many to Washington on January 6th to, in their minds, defend democracy. The words that come to mind for you to describe the feeling and the atmosphere there, what are they?
Patriotic, unity, hope.
When you hear other people describe it as a riot or an insurrection, how do you feel?
I feel upset.
Her belief that
Okay, so she's a grandmother of 10. She's a really lovely Southern woman who I think is threatening civil war in that clip. But the frame there, I think, is really clear. They go on to juxtapose her against a Black woman bartender from Brooklyn who supported Bernie Sanders in the 2016 primaries, and who, I will note, did not attack the U.S. Capitol. She's also not depicted with any family, this woman that they end up juxtaposing this nice Southern insurrectionist with. And so part of the concern here and the overlap between what I saw with the Tea Party and what I see with what's happening in the January 6th coverage is this mainstreaming of whiteness and white supremacy. And in part, this means the mainstreaming of white violence. As you kind of see in that clip that frames the insurrection through the eyes of a grandmother of 10 who calls it a joyful experience of unity. People died that day, as you probably all saw. So these photos get read differently, right, through the press. And I see that in the Tea Party. So this is the Tea Party year. This is a picture of Black Panthers. And you see that too with the way that the press covers the insurrection and the way that they cover the protest of the killing of George Floyd. And so this blind spot for white terrorism and white violence might explain the government's seeming,
because the way
I don't know.
Because
the government's seeming inability to investigate and thwart these threats. As Miller Idris pointed out in the Times essay I cited earlier, the U.S. has, quote, foiled only 21 of the 110 known domestic terror attacks and plots in 2020. And so if you keep thinking about that clip on CBS, keep that in mind, what it was conveying as you watch this exchange between Tucker Carlson and Senator Ted Cruz, that Ted Cruz posted to Twitter in January amidst the news coverage of the insurrection's anniversary.
Because the way I phrased things yesterday, it was sloppy and it was frankly dumb. And
I don't buy that. Whoa. I don't buy that. Look, I've known you a long time, since before you went to the Senate. You were a Supreme Court contender. You take words as seriously as any man who's ever served in the Senate. And every word you repeated that phrase. I do not believe that you used that accidentally. I just don't.
So Tucker, as a result of my sloppy phrasing, it's caused a lot of people to misunderstand what I meant. Let me tell you what I meant to say. What I was referring to are the limited number of people who engaged in violent attacks against police officers. Now, I think you and I both agree that if you assault a police officer, you should go to jail. That's who I was talking about. And the reason the phrasing was sloppy is I have talked dozens, if not hundreds of times. I've drawn a distinction. I wasn't saying that the thousands of peaceful protesters supporting Donald Trump are somehow terrorists. I wasn't saying the millions of patriots across the country supporting President Trump are terrorists. And that's what a lot of people have misunderstood that comment.
Wait a second, but even your wait, but hold on. What you just said doesn't make sense. So if somebody assaults a cop, he should be charged and go to jail. I couldn't agree more. We have said that for years. But that person's still not a terrorist. How many people have been charged with terrorism?
Okay. So this is Ted Cruz trying to kind of cover, because he gets criticism for saying that the insurrection was violent and that it was a form of terrorism, invading the capital of the United States and attacking police officers and trying to kill members of Congress. What I want to get at here is that we're not just talking about the reporting of an event, but how the news media directs its audience to read it, how to see it, how to define it, and how to hold it accountable. And so Fox News is able to kind of push these frames that are circulated and become embedded throughout the entire media ecosphere. And you see that with the January 6th insurrection, which brings me to another observation that links the news coverage to the Tea Party and the insurrection, the news as citizen activists. And what I want to clearly track is that in analyzing the rise of the Tea Party, I saw the members of the news media were more than just conduits for the Tea Party message and publicity, though they were that too. They started the Tea Party, as you saw with Santelli. They shaped the Tea Party narrative. They explored its meaning and significance, defended it, promoted it, started it. Gave it a platform, helped manage its branding, and provided it with leadership. And you can see even here, Fox News promoting the Tea Party, telling people where they can show up around the country to see and meet Fox News reporters in person. And this is all of the media, right? Not just conservative, though mainstream outlets were often provoked by conservative media to cover the Tea Party. And so one example of that is this Washington Post ad that Fox News takes out, accusing these other networks of not covering the one of the first Tea Party rallies. And this was a really important moment for me to find. And I'm sure others who saw it immediately kind of thought, oh, this is a publicity stunt. But when I saw it and I tracked how other kinds of regular provocations from Fox resulted in networks legitimizing, circulating conservative talking points, campaigns, and misinformation. So, for example, CNN responds to this ad by saying, oh, we did report, and they show, let's show you all of the Tea Party coverage that we did. They say that on the air. And later, CNN broadcasts the Tea Party State of the Union address in 2011. And that becomes the first time a television network ever airs a third party's rebuttal speech to the president's annual State of the Union address. And Rachel Maddow at the time actually calls it a remarkable act of journalistic intervention to elevate and affect a group with which they are co-sponsoring a presidential debate to the level of the major parties in this country. And so the promotion here is not incidental or ancillary. It's actually really central to the way that the Tea Party becomes something that we recognize and understand on the national landscape. As I note in my book, the Fox News functions more like a political third party than the Tea Party ever did. And I think this clearly connects to what we've seen of the January 6th reporting and investigation, right? And that was one of my conclusions, because I was trying to read how Fox News was covering it. And I was like, this is not just someone reporting or offering their opinions. They're headlining Tea Party events, right? There's a real mix of them functioning as political leaders during the rise of the Tea Party. So some of you probably have seen this. The January 6th committee sent an email request to Sean Hannity to testify around detailed information he might have had about January 6th and in regards to an investigation and the facts and circumstances on the interference with the peaceful transfer of power. So what they knew was that Hannity was getting information about what was happening in the background at the time, he's talking to people at the White House, holding key information about conflict among Trump lawyers and appointees and undermining the election. And the released text messages showed, as Chris Hayes put it, that Ingraham from Fox News and Sean Hannity were behind the scenes and in private working on, well, Media Matters argues that they were facilitating the coup. And both working on the attempted insurrection against the election, while they also working against it at the same time. And so here are some of the kind of advisory capacity that Fox News correspondents and reporters are functioning in at that moment. And this overlap, this advocacy overlap for journalists here presents some real concerns about journalistic ethics and undermines to some extent the journalistic protections that are highlighted, journalistic protections. And it's highlighted in this exchange between Chris Hayes and Congressmember. Do you guys hear that? Do you hear the wailing 3-year-old in the background? Can you? No? Yes? So sorry. Bedtime over here. Okay. These concerns about journalistic ethics and how it undermines journalistic protections are highlighted in this exchange between Chris Hayes and Congressmember Adam Schiff, discussing Sean Hannity's role in January 6th.
But one could argue you're slicing the salami pretty thin. I mean, if some government body got a hold of my text with sources and said, well, in this one you're being an advisor, in this one you're being a reporter, which, by the way, my texts to whoever don't sound like that. I'm not telling anyone how to land their plane. But that said, like, there is an argument to be made here that this is the kind of stuff that a robust free press should be able to protect from the prying eyes of government.
Well, first of all, we're asking him to come in voluntarily. And of course, there's nothing about his responsibilities with his show that would preclude him from coming in and say, I can certainly answer these questions. These go to my role as an advocate, as someone who the president would rely on for advice, and nothing to do with anything journalistic. So there's nothing precluding him from coming in.
Okay, and if you notice, Adam Schiff is obviously trying to explain why the freedom of the press doesn't apply in the contact between Fox News and presidential staff. And he's very careful throughout this interview to call them Fox personalities, right? Not journalists or reporters. And so what Fox News is doing too, I think in certain ways endangers other journalists. And lastly, one of the connections between what I observe in the rise of the Tea Party and what I've seen of the January 6th news coverage is the circulation of conservative misinformation in brands. And one of the examples I cite in my book is when Mark Williams, who is one of the key Tea Party leaders, he creates this blog that he says is a joke, where he talks in the voice of, I guess, a Negro, and says that Black people would like to return to slavery. He calls it satire. There's tons of backlash. He ends up resigning as chairman of the Tea Party Express, which is one of the biggest PACs and groups at the time. In response, Andrew Breitbart, who is now dead, but his website lives on, who is a high-profile conservative blogger, decides to make this video that shows this USDA Black woman agricultural official. He tries to make, she's giving a speech to the NAACP. He tries to make it look like she discriminated against Black people. Before the Fox News airs the clip, they report on the video. Bill O'Reilly and all the others on Fox call for her resignation. And then it moves through all these other platforms where white reporters and anchors are calling for her resignation. And the Obama administration actually fires her. They force her to resign. She gets disavowed by the NAACP. This is all before they actually all watch the full video, right? Ends up being a complete sham. But Breitbart says, actually, this isn't really about her. He admits that he was actually making a larger discursive move about using racism as a strategy. And what's fascinating is that Breitbart is called a propagandist, but he says he's a journalist, right? And so, I mean, there's a real question of journalists and what their function is at this moment. And he is kind of using racism and race, obviously, as to weaponize it. and he sees it as something that gets weaponized against conservatives. The New York Times, they call this whole incident humiliating, but that it's about the way that they get pressured to cover things by Fox News, by outlets like Fox News, and other outlets blame it on sensationalism and ratings. And so in this moment, how do I see that connecting? Well, you see the media take up a conservative campaign talking points, like the work to undermine teachings or trainings on diversity, Black history, racism, or white supremacy, both in workplaces and at schools. And that's been broadly branded as, quote, anti-critical race theory. And it shares in the similar think tank foundation political party mobilizing that spurred on the Tea Party. The man known as starting this recent brand, Christopher Rufo, tweeted about successfully branding anti-CRT in this tweet. And in terms of thinking of this as a defense of and support of the Tea Party brand through this kind of media circulation, I actually think all of this, really thinking about political branding and brand culture in our contemporary journalistic landscape, is also helpful to place Trump there, right? He's a president that drew on his own media brand to market himself in his campaign through using race and gender to further endear himself to the GOP. He got tons of free publicity. There's this really great moment that I'm not going to show you, but where he actually tells Chuck Todd, I don't have to spend my money on news coverage because you all keep doing it for me, right? You all keep giving me news publicity all the time. And so I keep saying, and I will always keep saying, that journalists have to really understand Trump as a brand and not as a leader or a classic politician, to understand his behavior in using platforms to amass wealth and followers, violate norms and goals, and to appreciate the urgent need to curb his efforts at misinformation and autocracy. And of course, there's always the truth that the press relied and maybe still relies on Trump to brand themselves, the Trump brand to benefit themselves financially. And so this is maybe you probably all have heard this maybe a semi-famous quote from Les Moonves, who is the CEO of CBS Corporation, who said, Trump might not be good for America, but he's good for us, right? Making tons of money. And this was, I think this was actually a 2016 quote, but I'll try to look at my notes to find it out. So to close out, here are some of the consequences and fallout that I see. I'm hoping that now there's at least some connections between the Tea Party, the rise of the Tea Party, and the January 6th insurrection playing out in your mind, and that you understand, well, why does this matter? What is the implication? And how does this connect to what's happening in news today? And so there's the I don't have it up here, the celebrification of politics. There's displacing activism, and that's in terms of having something like the rise of the Tea Party getting tons of news coverage, even when there are 5 or 10 people showing up to a protest, versus one of the largest protests that happened in the South around Memorial Monday organizing that does not get the same kind of news coverage. Race becomes an empty signifier in this type of news coverage. In branding, race becomes a marker of difference without distinction, provides no context, history, or reflection on the stigmatization, marginalization, and privilege assigned to global racial hierarchies, and assuages existing systems of power. And so journalists use race and racism as qualities of character in their reporting rather than provide a larger examination of the context and structure of race and racism in relation to the Tea Party formation, especially in terms of whiteness. And I think it's a failure that continues now, right? So this idea that race is an individual characteristic, or that racism can be a moral failing, reducing it to personal rather than systemic exchange. It becomes about sentiment rather than fact, context, or history. And again, I said displacing activism in the sense that a reliance on branding tactics and new technology has amplified the ability to mimic and manufacture social movements and elicit and dominate media news coverage. Rethinking citizenship, and that is that in my finding of the Tea Party news narratives and stuff that I see echoing in January 6th is that they reflect a major shift in how citizens and journalists today express criticisms towards the government through the language of investors and shareholders rather than the norms of society and community building. And for me, this all amounts to, I keep coming back, at least in my own head, the need for new journalistic agreements. New cooperative journalistic standards. I think we need agreements on allowing guests or airing politicians that have a verifiable history of lies and disinformation. I actually think deplatforming Trump should have been something that ABC, CBS, CNN, and other networks did before Twitter. And Rachel Maddow kind of played around with this by not playing his clips or even his voice. It was something that she did throughout his administration. And at the core of this, I think, fights against disinformation and the power of white supremacy has to be really advanced within news platforms, similar but not the same as efforts pushed in digital spaces like Facebook and Twitter. And I'm not saying we're anywhere near where we should be in those places, but the conversation is happening a lot more on social media than in the realm of journalism and news. Because amidst these news reporting practices, the potential for democracy and social change is left unrealized. And that is the end of my talk. Thank you all for being so attentive and hanging out with me. And I'll
Thank you, Dr. White, for this inspiring presentation. Now we'll turn it over to the participants. Valina.
Hi there. Hi, everybody. Thank you so much for joining us, Khadijah. That was awesome. And depressing also. Just that your book was really really prescient and not describing something that was like a flash and gone. So I know that you look at so many different types of things, and so this is one of your research projects. And I'd love to hear you just talk a little bit more about your research and connecting this thread, if there's a thread that you can bring it through, and maybe your public scholarship, because I think it's really, really fascinating, and I'm excited for some of my graduate students to hear about it as well.
Sure. Hi, Rolena. Thank you for being here. It's always wonderful to see you. My work in general is me trying to kind of track moments of kind of intense public scrutiny around, or clashes and conflicts that the media tracks over race, often in racism, but also moral panic. So sometimes I lean more towards one or the other, and sometimes there's clear intersections with both of those things, right? I mean, Stuart Hall talks about moral panic explicitly through the lens of looking at the mugging panic and race, and how that referential context and how that places moral panic in specific ways. So this work for me, again, was about kind of the rise of this phenomenon, this media phenomenon that seemed to really be about race and in response to the race of the 2008 campaign, but without talking about it. And how they had to kind of frame white activism in this moment as something that wasn't just, versions of white activism that we've seen before, like the Ku Klux Klan or the John Birch Society, right? So they had to try to kind of use sentiment to frame these people in a different context. I'm trying to think of how this links to my other work, which often is, so one of the other things I've written before has been on, I went to Baltimore after the Freddie Gray protest and talked to young Black activists there about their own representations in local news and what they felt about it as they tracked the news coverage throughout the Freddie Gray protest. And that was really important to me. And so I guess what I'm trying to constantly do as a researcher is use the time and the space that we have and the capacity we have to try to not only censor voices that don't get heard or analyze news in response to these kinds of panics around race and racism. But also, now that I'm tenured, I got tenure last year, I'm trying to really try to think about what that means in terms of community engagement. And so, I came out of a journalist background. And so part of the reason, even with my presentations, I use a ton of clips is because I want this work to feel accessible to people. I want them to kind of understand it. And so my writing project was actually on school security. What I learned on the ground here as an activist was that, and sure, all of you have kids who do these school drills. But I think of it as this really interesting reactionary move that allows people to kind of make, it's a cover for what happens with national shootings. And so when these shootings happen, all of a sudden there's this kind of preoccupation with how do we secure schools more firmly. And so to me, that's linked to moral panic in a very specific way. But as an activist, I've talked to kids. We did some interviews on the ground with our group. We created a video. And so I thought I was going to do a kind of documentary project where we really had to sit and reflect, use media to reflect on that policy and track how people respond to that. But then COVID happened. So I ended up designing these booths, these listening booths where people get to walk into the space to these booths that are kind of claustrophobic and they're completely dark. And they listen to kids talking about what it means to like hide in closets and hide in dark spaces during these school drills. And the last booth, they actually experience the drills, so they walk in. So each booth, they don't know what they're gonna go in, but the last booth has a red light and a siren that goes on for 5 minutes. And some people really can't handle that, right? The kids are sitting through this for sometimes 30, 45 minutes. So I have them record their reactions to that as they come out of the final booth is a reaction booth. And so that's the kind of work I'm trying to play around with right now, is trying to figure out how to make the work that we do as researchers more real to the folks that we actually work with in the communities that we engage in. Hopefully that's the through line, at least for me.
Dr. White, I might raise a question myself. So I'm wondering about, well, you talked about from Rick Santelli all the way to Tucker Carlson and Sean Hannity. And I'm wondering about your thoughts about what to do about it. For example, do you think it's better to have more regulations in terms of these so-called activist journalisms, or have you had thoughts about how to counter these types of strategies that are so popular in the last decade?
Yeah, I mean, so some of this comes down to like the fact that we have a Supreme Court that might, how would they rule? Like I've gotten into these really lengthy Twitter arguments with people about like, actually, we need to start legislating some of this stuff. We need to think about the arguments that people apply to social media as a utility and start thinking about that in terms of, I mean, lots of people have been writing about that for years, but I think really kind of strengthening some of the ways that we used to try to insist on news coverage not being disinformation and misinformation, and monitoring that in the past, and the FCC kind of being really looked at as a regulatory body over these spaces is something that I think we should bolster. But I don't look at journalistic policy enough to just kind of make that claim. And I think for me, what I've really been thinking about is like, well, are there ways that news corporations themselves can strengthen and agree to some sort of practice? So for example, if you know that a political candidate has a track record of disinformation, then maybe you don't platform them, right? In the same ways that Twitter and other spaces are saying we shouldn't be platforming people who do certain things, right? Or that they can be suspended, or there can be a period of suspension. And part of me is like, well, if these companies make an agreement, then they don't have this idea that, well, this person will platform this person, so they'll get the viewers over us. And so I think I've just been trying to think creatively along those lines, like what are ways that these organizations themselves can start trying to think about ethics, if that's even possible. I mean, some of that is fantasy, right? But it's one of those things that ideally, we as journalistic scholars can start to kind of come together and say, what are the ways, I mean, doing exactly what you said, what are the ways that journalists can confront this particular moment? And Daniel Kreis and other scholars did some of that work, right? When the election was happening, people were really concerned that they were going to try to overthrow the government. And so it was like, how are scholars in political communication going to come together and advise through this moment? And I think that that's some of the work too for us to take up.
Thank you.
Leah?
Yeah, Leah.
Thank you. I really appreciated your reminding us of sort of the history of the Tea Party movement and the way it sort of connects to the current moment. Of course, even before that, there was the moral majority. So, you know, there's there's a through line here in history. I'm wondering if you could tell me a little bit about what your thoughts are, though, in the sort of branding shift that has occurred with the current moment. It feels to me like there's something a little bit different. Like the Tea Party was supposed to be a grassroots movement. The moral majority was a whole movement. The current one is like, it's Trump, right? Even like MAGA, it's like Trump's slogan. And I'm wondering if there's something about the connection to a particular personality that makes the current moment even more dangerous or less dangerous. I don't know. I feel like more. Or is there a difference?
Yeah, I mean, I think that's a great question. And I don't know if I have an exact answer. I mean, I think what happened with Trumpism is that it gets mapped onto something like the Tea Party. And so there's this kind of understanding of Trump followers and MAGA followers as being grassroots, as being populist, as being you know, white working class disaffected folks. And so you start to see an overlap between the two. And that to me is just because Trump is a brand master, actually. And so he's really effective at promoting his own brand. I don't know if you've seen that CBS interview where on CBS News, they had a bunch of historians who met to talk about Trump's legacy. And he actually asked to speak to this group in the middle of their discussion, right, which is unusual for scholars, because he wants to be the person who defines his own legacy, and so he wants to persuade the scholars, these historians, on how they will frame him. So I think in part you see that because of him. I think it's also, again, this way in which he's been really adept at mapping himself onto this kind of populist anti-establishmentarian brand that I think the Tea Party was already tracking. I mean, I mean, you didn't ask me this. I think part of the success of Obama is because he is seen as anti-establishment. He's framed that way. He's a young Black man going up against an old white established politician. I think in part that's why, I mean, again, you did not ask me this, that Hillary Clinton ends up being a weaker candidate up against Trump, because there's an anti-establishment vein that's very clear from 2008 on. I think and part of that is linked to the Great Recession and what happens to a lot of people in that moment. So yeah, I don't know. I don't know if it's much different now in certain ways. I just think that Trump's been better at mapping on. I also think QAnon to me in certain ways is similar to the Tea Party, this like idea of this conservative thing that came out of the internet that is populist and is really directing and infiltrating the power of the Republican Party is also part of the larger discourse. Even when some of the stuff that they say, much of the stuff that they say is batshit crazy. I think you still see it get mainstreamed in certain ways as a particular political faction. Thanks, Lee. I hope that answered your question. Brooke?
Thank you, Dr. Raitt. So I was thinking about this permission of otherness when you were talking about women claiming to be mothers or like using this identity of mothers when they're not, and then white politicians writing in the voice of people of color or Black people. And I was wondering if you thought that this permission of otherness is a strategy to resist or that can be resistant of the Tea Party discourse, or is that a strategy that is instead reductionist and we shouldn't be playing on those terms?
I mean, obviously that kind of stuff precedes the Tea Party, right? Like soccer mom is a very, very like particular kind of political identity and brand in previous political campaigns. And so Mama Grizzly is just kind of genius. I mean, again, like Sarah Palin is a precursor to me to Donald Trump. She's like exceptionally good at branding. That's partly why she's so successful. I'm trying to think of your your quote. How did you describe it? Strategic otherness? How did you say it? Frame it?
Yeah, I said permission for otherness, or the privilege to give yourself a permission of otherness. I don't know. I was just writing as you were talking. It could be termed something else. I was just thinking about the privilege that you must have in order to be able to allow yourself to take on another's voice in public. So.
Well, and also to talk about race and racism, right, in very particular ways. And so what you see is when, like, for example, Black journalists starts talking about white supremacy and whiteness explicitly in terms of politics, they get fired. Jamel Hill gets fired. There's another politician who talks about Mitt Romney being uncomfortable around people who's not him. He gets fired. Excuse me. So there are certain people who get to talk like this. I mean, this is the problem with Fox News, right? There are no consequences for the things that they say and the things that they do, especially on their network. But in other networks, there's this kind of facade of journalistic ethics. Even, Chris Cuomo gets fired, right? In the context of the pandemic. And so there's that. There's this kind of this media ecosphere where you have one group that has no kind of bounds and this other group that is somehow reporting with some notion of bounds. It's just weird because when you said this, what I thought about was a story I was reading today about, I believe it was Philadelphia police that have been posing as Black people. Is it Philadelphia police? Posing as Black people on social media to critique like local NAACP. They were using covert accounts to pose as Black people and critique Black leaders and Black organizers online. And so again, when you talk about like who gets to masquerade or who gets to speak for other people, it's not a reciprocal thing, right? It's always kind of about power and who is allowed to use these platforms in a particular way. But I don't know if I would. I mean, Mark Williams he has to resign, right? There are consequences when you say Black people should be slaves again. Apparently there are lines for satire sometime. But I think, it is interesting, at least the ways in which race is framed in these kinds of conversations as a discursive move, as opposed to something to talk about in terms of power and the structure of our society. I hope that answers your question.
Yeah, thank you. Yeah, something to think about more too. Thank you.
Cool. Polly, I see your hand.
Yeah, I was really interested in your discussion of how mainstream media sort of gets manipulated and drawn in sometimes unintentionally complicit in the normalizing or mainstreaming of Tea Party style anti-democratic movements. I'm wondering how you think mainstream media can discuss movements like this without normalizing them or making them seem somehow less radical than they are. For example, QAnon was very present at January 6th. How can the media acknowledge that and talk about it without unintentionally normalizing or mainstreaming QAnon?
Yeah, I mean, it's like my husband likes to watch CBS on Sunday mornings. I spend most of the time screaming and yelling at it because I like to call it Fox News Light, which basically means that there's a lot of frames there where they kind of mainstream whiteness, right? There's one piece where like Charles Murray comes on and they're like, these students are protesting him. It's so cruel. But they don't talk about the fact that he's effectively a eugenicist. And so I say all that to say that clip that I show, when you ask me that question, I'm thinking about that clip of this old white woman, their choice to take pictures of her and her family, frame her as a grandmother of 10, and then use quotes that describe the, sorry if you lost, I don't know what happened to the light. These quotes that describe her, allow her to frame the insurrection as something that was a peaceful, joyous moment. Those are all framing selections, right? Those are all choices. And so I think part of it is not allowing people to use the news to promote false narratives, right? I mean, if you're gonna have a person say it was all peaceful and it was joyous, I think you have to juxtapose that against, like, extensively against images of what really happened that day. You can't kind of just repeat disinformation. That was part of the problem with Trump, right? Was that they would just repeat the things he said. It's like, except Trump said that the sky was green today. And like, that's the close of the segment, right? Like, okay, I guess maybe it's green, maybe it's not blue anymore. And I think, so I think part of it is that work is to not, I mean, people say this all the time, both sidesism, right? Like this idea that there's an equivalence to what people are saying when it's actually clear misinformation. This nice Southern grandmother who is like, she's saying that basically we'll revolt, like we are willing to take up arms and protest, right? I mean, she's very clear. She's like, I didn't go to an insurrection, but I'm willing to, participate in a civil war. But she says it in a really lovely, sweet voice. And the framing in that piece, when they go to this Black woman, she does not get family members. She does not get a background story. She does not get to, be embraced in her backyard amongst her loved ones. Like there's a very clear division. So I guess for me, a lot of this feels very intentional. This mainstreaming of whiteness and the mainstreaming of these folks that in stories that humanize them. And that's the same process that you see with a lot of white supremacist groups. I mean, when they talk about themselves, they talk about their love of family, their love of community, the love of, that they don't hate Black people, they just love themselves and love their culture. And so you have to be really careful about kind of repeating the strategic marketing effort around white supremacy. And maybe part of that is them learning it. Maybe some of that is journalists actually getting really intentionally trained on these frames. But also I think some of it is just being like, am I treating this topic with the importance and the seriousness that it deserves? You can't just kind of turn the insurrection into a day of joy and fun, because that's actively participating in, disinformation about what happened that day and what we all saw.
Are there any last minute hands? All right, why don't we all thank Dr. White again for the lovely talk. Khadijah, thank you again for participating in the Q&A, providing a lovely presentation. Thank you so much.
Of course, thank you all for having me, and I hope it was interesting at the very least that you will all join me in, hating CBS Sunday News some days. Okay, all right, it was wonderful to meet you all.
Yeah, thank you.
Bye, thank you.
Bye.